Okay, so this is going to be a summary for chapter 6 through 13. So we've got, in our last video, the slaves are branded, they're in the pen, they're waiting to get taken out. Amari catches a glimpse at Besa, and she hasn't seen him since they were marching in the slave coffle. And we see a moment where it's truly heartbreaking for Besa. Because he was a village warrior, he was given the task to protect the villagers. And he's just absolutely disgusted with himself because he couldn't do that. Now, you and I know there's no way that he could have. There's no way that he and a group of Iwi men and women, but men in this day, could ever go against white slave traders with a group of Ashanti men. The Ashanti men know the land, they know the weapons and everything, and the white slave traders had guns, and they had, money for other kind of technology that these African folk had never even seen. And Amari wants to explain that to him, like, hey, don't be embarrassed, don't be ashamed, but that's just part of their culture. And he is embarrassed and ashamed, and it's just kind of a really heartbreaking moment. Once we start getting loaded onto the slave ship, we see that there are significantly more male than there are women, and we know the reason for that. And the reason for that is that men were better breeders. Again, a very disgusting and terrible way to describe a human being, but it goes back to that dehumanization again. And it was perceived that men would be better workers because they were, in general, in physical body, bigger and stronger. So the men were stacked 3 high on the slave ship. They were forced to live in their own waste for those some 3 months on the ship. Many of them died of infection, disease spread, because the white people were bringing in diseases that no one had ever seen. The Africans also had diseases that the white people had never seen. Those diseases kept perpetuating each other. They only fed them very little. They only gave them very little fresh water. They never took baths because they weren't allowed to. So all those open wounds would just fester. It was really terrible. And because the slave men were considered cargo, if any cargo was lost, it was no big deal to the white slave traders because they could cash it in for insurance money, which is pretty awful. I mean, really, really awful. The slaves on the ship were either naked or mostly naked, and they did that to dehumanize them. They did that very on purpose to instill shame in them and make them feel embarrassed. Below deck where the men were, they had no idea if it was night or day. They had no idea how much time had gone by. And that doesn't necessarily seem like a huge issue, but that messes with your brain. They did that on purpose to mess with their mind. That was a way of keeping them under control mentally. And again, that's another dehumanizing thing, because they want to have physical control over the slaves and mental control over the slaves in order to instill a weakness in them. So they're too afraid to revolt, they're too afraid to fight back, things like that. Plus, they're in the middle of an ocean. They had never, before this, the African folk had never been anywhere where they had not seen land somewhere. So looking out for the first time, you got on a ship off of a shore, and then you get let out in 2 days or whatever, and you look around, there's no land. That would also be terrifying. Keep in mind as well, all of these African folk speak their own language. They don't speak English at all. So it just sounds like gibberish to these African folk when these ship guys are speaking Spanish or English. It doesn't sound like anything. It just sounds like noise. So every time they have a command towards the slaves, and then the slaves don't follow, they whip or whatever, or beat. That's just totally unfair, because they don't even know what they're saying. The women were splashed with water, and they were forced to wash and dance for the sailor men. And we know that because they were sexually abused at night. And actually, Amari, to this point, she was completely saving herself for marriage to Besa, and she was engaged to Besa, but she was sexually abused. She was raped on the ship, and that was, her first time. And that's really sad and disgusting, whether it's your first time or not, whether you're married or not, whether you're old or not. Sad and disgusting that this happened to them, but it did. It absolutely happened. And this was just one more way for the white slave traders to control the slave women. Of course, we don't get any details or anything, which we don't need those. The women stayed chained above deck because they were considered sort of mostly harmless. We did already see one woman jump outside of the tugboat when she was, or rowboat, I guess, not tugboat, rowboat, on the way to the slave ship, and she jumped out to try to escape, and she got ate by a shark. We said in class the thing that would have attracted the sharks to the shore would have been all the blood and sort of like food and human waste and stuff from the slave ship. We met a redheaded sailor named Bill. Bill was sort of the one nice white guy that we have met. He taught Amari some English words, which was really important because you're never going to ever get control if you don't have education and you don't speak the language. He let her bathe. He gave her some fresh water and gave her some food. Now, we said this in class, but just to reiterate, just because Bill did not rape her, because he didn't, and just because he gave her some extra food and water and stuff, does not make him a good person. It makes him maybe a better person than some of the other sailors on the slave ship because he didn't rape her. It doesn't make him a good person, because ultimately at the end of the day, he is still a sailor on a slave ship. He is still working with people who are being kidnapped from their home. Their families are being killed right in front of them, and they are being taken to a completely different land. Bill knows that they're human. He knows. That's why he teaches her English. That's why he doesn't rape her. He doesn't want to dehumanize, but then again, he is, because he's working on a slave ship. That's bad enough. He shouldn't be doing that at all. So, while we might say that Bill is better than some of the other sailors, I would hesitate to call him a good person, because to me, he's not a good person. He's a bad person. He's a bad man. They encountered a storm on the last part of the journey in the Middle Passage. Many of the male slaves died in this storm, and actually many of them had already died from disease and whatnot, like we talked about earlier. But 16 women died as well, because the rapids were so, it was just like so crazy in this storm. One woman's daughter was actually fell off the boat, and she jumped in after to save her. And some students always ask me, like, did she think that she was going to come back to the ship? No, I don't think so. I think that she knew that she was going to die, but she felt like at this point, maybe she had come so far with her daughter, and then her daughter was gone. She had nothing else to live for. So she chose to jump in. Amari and Affie did make it. So did Besa. And Affie, she's the one that warned Amari about the rapes and told her what it was like. And Affie was still there to comfort her, even though Affie couldn't stop it, because Affie herself was also being sexually abused. She was still there to comfort her. And I think that's good. I think it's good that they had each other at least. But Affie also tells her, because again, Affie knows the ropes. She knows what it feels like to be sold. Affie also tells her, once we get to the slave auction, we don't know what's going to happen. We could be separated. We could stay together. Amari is hopeful that she will get to stay with Affie, but I guess we'll just have to see. So the ship finally arrived in Carolina Colony, which I've posted this in your notes. There's a map there. There's a nice map there. And Carolina Colony today is North and South Carolina. The equivalent of the area that we're arriving in Carolina Colony is actually in modern day South Carolina. It's actually so it's on the coast. Obviously, we're right by ocean. It's kind of like towards the bottom of South Carolina. And the first place that we go to is Sullivan's Island. And we talked about this in class, but just to reiterate, it kind of reminds you of Ellis Island. They actually called it the Ellis Island of slavery, because in these early days of slavery, a lot of people arrived into the colonies via Sullivan Island. And it was about 40% of all the slaves arrived there during the years 1700 and 1775. Remember, our book takes place in 1738. They were forced to quarantine for some days first to make sure that they didn't have any disease, because none of the white slave owners would want to buy a diseased slave. 2 reasons. Number one, they don't want the disease. Secondly, they don't want their slave dying on them, because remember, these slaves are considered cargo, or like livestock animals, dehumanized. So they're seen as an item. So they stay in Sullivan's Island for a while, quarantining to make sure they don't have any diseases. She does see Besa again. He tries to talk to her, and he gets beaten for trying to talk to her. They come across a slave man, an Ashanti tribesman named Tybee, and he basically says to them, I know it's hard. I know you're angry. I know you're sad, but keep your eyes down. Listen, learn as much as you can, and don't cause a ruckus, because they will kill you. And he's very particular about that. He's very serious about that. Please be careful, because they will kill you. So after they quarantine for a while, they are sent off to the slave auction in Charlestown. So we're away from Sullivan's Island, and we're more into Charlestown right now, or Charleston, South Carolina, as it's known today. And we talked about this in class, but it was a really dehumanizing thing that happened to these folks. The buyers would come, and they would run their hands all over their body. They would stick their hands in their mouth to check for cavities or whatnot. And they would run their hands all over their bodies, and they would do this as a way to check their muscles and for diseases and things like that. And these poor enslaved people just had to stand there and let it happen in front of all these other people. They were naked, completely nude, standing on that auction block. And all these people were touching on them, and they just had to deal with it. It was really sad. Besa And the rest of the people from the Iwi tribes, that was 15 of them, they're all sold into different places. So she's going off on this plantation all by herself. She doesn't know anybody there. And of course, probably the saddest moment is that she's separated from Affie. And the slave auctioneer actually says, oh, do you want the mom? Even though it's not her mom. And the person who buys Amari, his name's Percival Derby, he says, oh, no, I don't want to buy family. That just confuses them. They'll forget about each other in a couple days anyways. Which is really sad. I can't believe he said that, but historic accuracy, very accurate. That is something that a slave owner would say, because they were awful people. They were just awful, terrible people. That just kind of lets you know how they view the slaves. They don't even think that they're human. They don't even think that they're human people. That they're just stupid and don't even know what family bond is. And that's why he specifically wanted to separate them. And that's not unheard of. Some people bought family units, but most people didn't. So he probably saw Affie as an older woman not fitting his purpose and didn't want to buy her.